brothers and sisters in the struggle for human dignity and freedom. I am here to represent the struggle that has gone on for 300 or more years, a struggle to be recognized as citizens in a country in which we were born. I have had about 40 or 50 years of struggle, ever since a little boy on the streets of Norfolk called me a nigger. I struck him back, and then I had to learn that hitting back with my fist one individual was not enough. It takes organization. It takes dedication. It takes the willingness to stand by and do what has to be done when it has to be done. A nice gathering like today is not enough. You have to go back and reach out to your neighbors who don't speak to you. And you have to reach out to your friends who think they are making it good and get them to understand that they, as well as you and I, cannot be free in America or anywhere else where there is capitalism and imperialism until we can get people to recognize that they themselves have to make the struggle and have to make the fight for freedom every day in the year, every year, until they win it. Thank you.
Ella Baker made that speech at a 1974 Puerto Rico Solidarity rally. It's a wonderful example of Baker's character and approach to activism. She was an anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, and intersectional activist who wanted to make this struggle every day. What she meant by that is by connecting with those around her and building community and raising awareness of the injustices in the world brought about by imperialism and capitalism. She was a community builder and intimately connected to many major moments in American history. This podcast will rely heavily on Catherine Clinton's 1991 writings on Baker in the Portraits of American Women. Baker was born in 1903 to Blake and Georgiana in Norfolk, Virginia. In 1910, Baker and her parents moved to Littleton, North Carolina. They lived in close proximity to her maternal grandparents on the land that they had formerly been enslaved upon. After emancipation, her grandfather had built a church and became a pastor. Baker's grandmother chose her husband despite the wishes of their enslavers. This led to her being forced to work the fields, and displays a history in their family of resistance to white authority and building relationships on their own terms. Baker's aunt was a midwife and raised children that no one else in the community wanted to. There was an extremely strong sense of community in Littleton surrounding Baker. Many of the people who lived on the farms near her were relatives. Baker said, quote, "It wasn't a town, it was just people, and each of them had 20, 30, 40-acre farms. This community had been composed to a large extent by relatives. Over the hill was my grandfather's sister, who was married to my Uncle Carter, and up the grove was another relative who had a place." Baker was surrounded by this strong, resilient community that resisted slavery together and the economic injustices that followed. The presence of such strong care for one another in her community inspired Baker to be a medical missionary when she was young. This also shows that she saw the globe as her community. Baker was well educated when she was young, and her family emphasized it heavily. She graduated from Shaw University with a bachelor's degree in 1927 and moved to New York, hoping to make money to pursue a master's degree in sociology from the University of Chicago. Baker was denied many opportunities that she was qualified for due to her race in New York, and at the same time the Great Depression hitting made the economic circumstances impossible for her to save enough money to attend the University of Chicago. Observing the Great Depression in Harlem and seeing the black community especially struggle had a huge impact on Baker. Quote, The tragedy of seeing long lines of people standing, actually waiting on the bread line for coffee or handouts, this had its impact. Baker would go on to write for many newspapers in her time in New York, and was fully committed to a career in activism by this time. Baker worked in government programs, women's clubs, and helped sponsor cooperatives and housing projects. Baker worked tirelessly within her community for change. It was also in New York where Baker was exposed to a hotbed of political thought that helped her hone in her own politic and understand her approach to activism. She was community-centered and did not find hierarchy and guiding people by telling them exactly what to do to be effective. She found connecting with people individually and small, spontaneous movements to be the ones that created the most change. Before Baker's politic had been fully defined by others or even defined by herself, she practiced her principles in New York. In Mie Inouye's 2022 article, Starting with People Where They Are, Ella Baker's Theory of Political Organizing, the author argues that against the consensus that Ella Baker's activism and activism like it, specifically that is non-hierarchical, is non-ideological, the author argues that all activism is ideological, and Baker's ideology is clearly able to be extracted from her history. Baker is usually depicted solely as a facilitator, a listener, and a receiver, and this narrow interpretation of her activism de-emphasizes her attempts to move people towards her vision of a radically transformed society. Organizers make decisions based on their own ideologies, and they attempt to maintain or reshape the dominant ideologies. Organizers are political theorists in this sense. They have self-conscious theories of how society works and changes based on which they make strategic decisions on how to act. Baker was once quoted as saying that in order for people to organize a community properly, they had to first, quote, understand their own right to participation in all the decisions that affect their lives. She continues, then comes the question, how do you reach people if they aren't already conscious of this? You start with people where they are. Baker was not passive and asserted the importance of her viewpoints and her understanding of the present world as well as the world she wanted to help create. This definition of ideology that determines that Baker is non-ideological is rigid and outdated. Ideology is fluid and changes from situation to situation, but Baker's principles remained consistent throughout her activism. Baker's practice of resistance was centered on this meeting of people where they were, and teaching and sharing and connecting based on her experiences and wisdom on resistance and her survival within oppression. Baker was often and still is referred to as the midwife of the civil rights movement. This is reflected in the chapter of Baker's activism she is most popularly remembered for, her involvement with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Commission, or SNCC, and commitment to connecting with her community through her empowering ideology. Baker showed her intersectional approach to activism in the way that she addressed classism in her fieldwork. Baker observed that there was resentment between the poor and the rich, even within the Black community. She pointed out one instance where she went to Florida for the first time working for the NAACP, where she says, quote, I got a contribution for a lifetime membership in the NAACP, which was $500 then from a longshoremen's union. They remembered somebody who had been there before from the NAACP with a mink coat. When they gave this $500 membership, somebody mentioned it. See, they resented the mink coat. I don't think it was the mink coat they really resented, but it was the barrier they could sense between them and the person in the coat. Baker would continue to assert the importance of class in her activism for the rest of her life. Baker would resign from the NAACP in 1946 as she became the guardian of her niece and raised her in her home in Harlem. Baker had also become disillusioned with the male-dominated hierarchical structure of the organization. She resisted it through her fieldwork, but never made it a point to make herself the focal point of conversation. In 1955, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white passenger on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama, and sparked a massive movement, a bus boycott across the city. In 1957, an organization known as the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was started, hoping to grow the use of nonviolent direct action throughout the South. Baker joined this organization in 1958, but left in 1960 as something huge was changing in the civil rights movement. Many spontaneous, nonviolent protests, especially sit-ins, started sparking up all over the South. These actions were not developed by any larger organization, but the students acting out of their own volition to make change. As previously stated, Baker was not passive in her activism, and this is a perfect example of it. Baker was re-energized and inspired by these student movements and recognized the opportunity to empower students. Baker requested and was granted funding to have a meeting at Shaw University at Raleigh, North Carolina on the Easter weekend of 1960. Baker organized much of the meeting and made sure that the students were centered. The keynote statement was read by John Lawson, who is a student from Nashville that had led many of the sit-ins in that area. The purpose of the meeting, as stated by Baker, was, quote, to share experience gained in recent protest demonstrations and to help chart future goals for effective action. Baker also emphasized that the conference was to be youth-centered and that adult freedom fighters were there for counsel and guidance. Despite this, many leaders of the SCLC hoped that they could bring the student nonviolent protesters under their organization and take control of the movement. The leadership of the SCLC hoped and expected Baker to support their goal of funneling the students into their organization. Baker, however, had other plans. She liked the student philosophy of group-centered leadership and found it refreshing for those who, quote, bore the scars of battle, the frustration and disillusionment that come when the prophetic leader turns out to have heavy feet of clay. Baker clashed strongly with the Christian patriarchal ideas of what a woman should be and did not meet these expectations within the organization. On the second day of the meeting, Reverend King and two other leading SCLC members called a meeting with Baker to discuss what would happen at the rest of the gathering. Baker was determined to keep the students in power and found King's prophetic activism tired and uninspiring. At the meeting, the three members of the SCLC other than Baker tried to get Baker to agree to help organize the students as a student arm of the SCLC. When Baker was pressured to support a motion to make this happen, she walked out of the meeting. It's not hard to tell how one who's writing the story from a certain lens may construe this as Baker being passive. However, she was determined in helping to create her vision of activism, and the way that she did this was not through discussion with those who she believed weren't listening to her. The next day, when it became clear that the students would not be joining the SCLC, Dr. King and the other leaders at the SCLC left the conference early. The students voted and agreed to form the SNCC, or SNCC, a group that was supposed to be democratic and was to meet every month to continue the dialogue on these nonviolent protests. This was a momentous moment in the civil rights movement, and despite this, there were a lot of troubles to follow. SNCC did not have the financial backing that the SCLC did and had trouble surviving through the first few months. Claiborne Carson was quoted as saying, "SNCC would probably not have survived its first summer had it not been for the energy and skills of Baker and Stembridge." Whereas SNCC appeared to outsiders and even to many black student leaders to merely a clearinghouse for the exchange of information about localized protest movements, the two women it was potentially an organization for expanding the struggle beyond its campus base to include all classes of black people. Baker was patient and determined to connect with these students and found it exhilarating. She was remembered to have worn surgical masks on her face, sitting through hours of philosophical debates in rooms filled with cigarette smoke. In 1964, SNCC organized the Freedom Summer, in which thousands of students moved south to Mississippi in order to register as many voters as they possibly could to vote. Baker saw voting as very powerful, as evidenced by her democratic principles she took into consideration in all of her activism. The Democratic Party and many white Mississippians resisted strongly this push to have black voters register. In response, SNCC created the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. Baker was a keynote speaker at the party convention in Jackson, Mississippi. When denied a full delegation for the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party at the Democratic National Convention, Baker and her people protested outside. In the same way that she had left the meeting with Dr. King when he demanded she give up her personal power, she took the matters into her own hand and went outside, never appealing to power and reaching out to others. In 1967, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party had Robert Clark elected. He was the first African American to serve in the Mississippi State Legislature since Reconstruction. Baker would continue to join, found, and be a major part of many more organizations in the coming years, including the Puerto Rican Solidarity Committee, which is where the speech at the beginning of this podcast is from. Baker would engage in anti-imperialist activism and anti-capitalist activism, specifically against apartheid in South Africa and against American imperialism. Baker comments, quote, "To me, I'm part of the human family. What the human family will accomplish, I can't control. But it isn't impossible that what those who came along with me went through might stimulate others to continue to fight for a society that does not have those kinds of problems. Somewhere down the line, the numbers increase, the tribe increases. So how do you keep on? I can't help it. I don't have any corner on an answer, but I believe that the struggle is eternal. Somebody else carries on." Baker was often quoted as saying, "Strong people don't need strong leaders." This was embodied in the way she engaged in activism. She sought to reach out to people, to get them in touch with their situation, and create strong, resistant individuals who could continue on this everyday struggle. Baker did not make a fortune within her lifetime as an activist. She often lived paycheck to paycheck, quoted as saying she just scraped by. The everyday struggle was central to Baker's way she lived her life and her philosophy to activism. She knew she wasn't going to be the big name that changed everything and started a movement that shifted the world forever. Her story should be communicated as one of patience and strength, not one of passivity. Baker's life was documented in the 1984 film Fundi, made by filmmaker Joanne Grant. Fundi is a Swahili term of honor and respect for a person that signifies a fountain from which knowledge and power flow. Baker, like so many other women, was not just the midwife of all these movements. She was an equal participant and often the instigator of many of the changes that led to effective action, which was what she was so passionate about. So, how should the story of Ella Baker be told? It depends on who you ask. For the longest time, the stories of resistors have been told by those in power who actively resisted against those resistors. It makes plenty of sense why those people would not want the message that anyone can be a resistor to meet the general population. Instead, it's conveyed that it takes a special person with exceptional charisma and mass appeal that can start a movement to change everything. I'd argue that this is why stories such as Baker's are not told as much, and when they are told, they're told in a way that diminishes her resistance. When asked about Martin Luther King and his leadership during the Civil Rights Movement, Baker was quoted as saying, "Yes, I don't attribute to him the leadership powers and credit to him that achievement that some people credit in terms of the Civil Rights Movement. You see, I think, to be very honest, the movement made Martin rather than Martin making the movement. This is not a discredit to him. This is to me as it should be. The only discrediting factor would be if this contradicts his own assessment of whom made whom. and this, no doubt, may have at points been part of whatever lack of comfort he may have found in any association with me. You see, this is my basic belief, and I have no capacity for worshiping the leader, because I know it's not a healthy thing. There is no one person who can provide the needs, I mean the leaderships, of a movement. That was from an interview with Ella Baker from John Britton in Washington, D.C. in 1968, from crmvet.org. Another interview that was conducted with Baker in 1977 was for the Southern Oral History Program with Sue Thrasher and Casey Hayden, retrieved from unc.edu. Baker speaks about her grandmother and her memories of her in her childhood. My grandmother lived till 96, but she was my escape valve because she was very gay. She identified with young people. She played catch with us. I'm sure she must have been in her 70s, and she was something of a raconteur, I suppose, recounting what took place during her period of slavery. And she was very healthy. We did some farming, and if Grandma was around, we would have rest periods, if you were chopping cotton or whatever else. She was seldom there, though, at the time of chopping cotton. My mother couldn't stand stripping the corn for fodder for the cattle. She had, I guess, hay fever and asthma, so she would start sneezing. So Grandma, even after we got some styes, would come over and we would go and pull the fodder. In one instance, there was a man who raised lovely watermelons. Grandma would go to buy a watermelon, and she knew where to put it in the woods in the shade to keep it cool. Before maybe even lunch, she'd let us stop and eat something. Baker was extremely humble in understanding how she became the woman who was so influential in her time. She gives it up to her family, her grandmother, her mother, and the people around her who were there for her formation of herself. We can take many lessons from Baker's resistance and the way it was portrayed today. As the apartheid state of Israel conducts a genocide of the Palestinian people in our present moment, thousands of college students across the nation have sprung up into nonviolent protests. There are undoubtedly thousands of those adult freedom fighters who are centering those students and helping them have their voices heard and own their movement to resist against what they see as unjust. Movements similar to this one in contemporary times, such as the Black Lives Matter movement, the women's marches, and more, have similarly been not focused on one major person who's leading the movement. While it's easy to say we can look to Baker for inspiration, Baker would probably redirect ourselves to look to those around us. Look to our neighbors, our colleagues, our coworkers, those who we're resisting with and those who we're resisting against, and connect with them and try to make stronger people around us, because strong people don't need strong leaders. The Resistance Revival Chorus is a group of non-binary individuals and women who come together to sing songs of resistance from the Civil Rights Movement and other times. Bernice Johnson Reagan was once a member of SNCC, who later formed an a cappella group called Sweet Honey in the Rock, who sang many songs about resistance back in their day. This cover that follows is done by that Resistance Revival Chorus and contains many of the most powerful messages that Baker communicated to the world throughout her life.
We'll believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. Freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. Until the killing and a number as we stand against tyranny. To me, young people come first. They come first. They have the courage where we fail. If I can just shine a light on as they carry us through the gale, we who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. I'm a woman who speaks in a voice, and I must be heard. At times I can be quite difficult. I'll bow to no man's word. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. Come on, sing. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. We who believe in freedom, we cannot rest. 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 We will not rest. We who believe in freedom, we cannot rest. We will not rest. We who believe in freedom, we cannot rest. We will not rest. We who believe in freedom, we cannot rest. We will not rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until. Come on, sing now. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes.
This recording and the recording that preceded it encapsulates so much of what made Ella special as a person. The content of the song is so focused and repetitive and unrelenting on freedom and what it takes to get to freedom. The emotion is joyful from the singers, and that she saw joy as an act of resistance. In the interviews that were previously referenced, Ella was laughing in almost every single question she answered. And it's just a very, very beautiful song. Thank you for listening. I hope I conveyed Ella Baker's journey through life well, and her impact she had on the world and how the world impacted her. And hope you enjoyed. Thank you.